la severo ala mangizila saya te motu kibidia saya maisa saya sajuye sirala saya silama kiloto severo sate jonza
Jamako soye
Jamako chega ni dola doi
Entigi adebi mateme mala Jamado fini benembe dola doi Jamako soye
Jamako chega ni dola doi
Entigi adebi mateme mala Jamado fini benembe dola doi Dola doye, sambarani nyuma benembe dola doye, benembe dola doye, burenga sanu benembe dola doye, na fentigi adebi mateme mala, non te mogolu manka.
Jamako, 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 Jamako. Jamako, 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 Jamako. Jamako, 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 Jamako.
Sonkolo dumambela, sonkolo dumambela. Ni de mango oyara, duba kono, uba fo jalondo, kasoro jalonte. Ni de mango oyara, duba kono, uba fo fanato, kasoro fanante. Ni de mango oyara, duba kono, uba fo yatime, kasoro yatimante. Kana baga walide ma ama vengila, kana baga falato ma ama vengila, ni kana baga yatime ma ama vengila, ni kana baga falato ma ama vengila. Son 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 wa, son 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 wa, son 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 wa, son 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 wa. Ibe falato no sabogeleya, ibogeleya, ibe demise no sabogeleya, ibogeleya, ibe kamale no sabogeleya. Hey, son son son.
on talk.
Sorry? No. Good afternoon, everyone. Right, here we go. Can I begin? I'm waiting for someone. Hello. Right, so there's some faces I don't know here, which is exciting.
Yeah.
So I'm William Bird, and I run MMA. Welcome to the third and last of our intimate conversations, and this I hope will probably or possibly be one of the best ones, although it's hard to imagine after yesterday's, which was really, really cool and traumatic. Today's will be cool, but hopefully not traumatic, because unlike yesterday, we don't have journalists talking about the sheer trauma that they go through to exist, but today we're going to talk about some of the difficult things and some of the best things, which is in relation to policy. And it's going to be cool because we've got two of our favorite friends of MMA speaking. Kgotatso Mampa, who, if you were here last night, you would have seen him with his game show hat on.
Hey, everybody.
Good, I like that. That was a deep, sexy voice. That's very good. And then we're joined by Tina Power, who we work with on a regular and ongoing basis, and she's just fabulous. And she's been behind, having been driven ruthlessly to produce a paper that actually that we will send to you if you give us your details. Essentially, the focus of this today is looking at how we deal with the sticky issue of disinformation online. And we think we've got something that's tending towards an answer. And the idea is to talk about it, what it looks like, where it should go, where it could go. So this is very much a policy for those that get excited by policy. This is for you. If you're not excited by policy, you should still listen because you'll learn a lot anyway. I think that's enough of an introduction. Over to you. Thank you. Begin.
Well, what am I beginning? Well, hello, everybody. Hi.
As you can see, we've planned this really well.
Yeah. So, hi, guys. I'm Kgotatso Mampa. I'm an IT lawyer, but for some reason, I find myself saddled with media law issues. I'm here to be a discussant. This is Tina's production. So, Tina will be bouncing off ideas on me and you, and we'll have one big, intimate discussion.
Fair enough. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a history as to why I'm sitting here today somewhat reluctantly, but somewhat persuadable on where we go next. 2 years ago, William asked me to fix disinformation, and he asked if I could do it within a week. I laughed. He didn't. We have been having ongoing conversations for 2 years on how we fix disinformation. We don't have the solutions yet. We have some options, some things to discuss, and would really welcome your views on whether or not we've got this horribly wrong, or if we may be onto something quite useful. We then started reflecting on if we should go really big. Should we take on the world? Should we have a global regulatory body that is going to monitor the platforms and make everyone kind and good online? And can we actually do that? Probably not, realistically. So we decided to start a little bit smaller, which is what we're going to be discussing today, but would welcome pushback if you think we may have gone too small. So within the context of these 2 years of us going back and forth, William asking me on a weekly basis whether or not I fixed disinformation, we now have the online Integrity Ombud that we would like to propose to this audience today to see if it is a feasible idea. We have proposed it to the Competition Commission in the recent round of submissions related to the market inquiry, and that's where the idea kind of started formulating a bit more. We then fleshed it out into what we called a briefing note that William will share with those who have an interest. Some members of the audience have already taken a look at it and provided some wonderful feedback. So we do see this very much as a baseline and as a draft that we want to work on and flesh out and develop. What we're trying to think of, and I'm going to use an analogy that William has used more than once, and it relates to a polluted river. And how William sees it, and he's probably far better placed to explain this, and will do so far more eloquently, but I will give it a good shot, is that social media platforms essentially pollute a river, the river being our information ecosystem. And they, by failing to remove content or by enabling and profiting and encouraging and incentivizing really harmful and bad conduct, they are polluting our ecosystem online, and they're polluting the river. And as we were figuring out sort of climate change more broadly, we need to hold those who are polluting the river accountable. They must be responsible for what they are doing, and they must take steps to limit the pollution or to clean the river. And that's what we're trying to figure out here. So the focus of this is not on individual people who may be sharing disinformation or hate speech or incitement. It's about the platforms and their role in creating space for people to do these bad things. So I just wanted to frame that as a sort of note. And I see you are looking excited. Can I give 3 caveats and then you can come at me?
Sure.
So as a lawyer, I'm going to caveat this extensively because that's what we do. This is an idea. It's not set in stone. It is not firm. It is not policy. Maybe one day it will be. Hopefully one day it will be. But it does need more nuancing. It does need more discussion. I'm somewhat persuaded that it's a good idea. I'm hoping after today I will be fully persuaded. William is fully persuaded, and that's lovely. So if there are any doubts, you should chat to him. This idea isn't going to fix everything. It's one piece of the puzzle. There are multiple different strategies we need to adopt. This isn't the silver bullet. I also don't have all of the answers. Please ask questions and probe me and say why this, why that, why not this. I may not know, but let's figure it out together. And please be critical. I would welcome this to be a discussion. William and I have been bouncing this idea off each other for 2 years. We kind of need some other voices in the room so that it's not just us operating in our little William-Tina silo. So we really want to encourage debate and hear from you. Over to you.
Well, Tina, thanks very much for that critical distinction about this, all of this that we're discussing applying to platforms and not individuals. But I was wondering if we could maybe go back to base principles, as in what is disinformation? Because I mean, we take it for granted that everybody, we assume that everybody understands and widely accepts the definition of disinformation. And I think you will agree that information is siloed these days. We all plug into what we plug into. And what I've seen or observed is that people come up and say, well, you call what I'm saying disinformation because you just have a different perspective on the matter.
Fair question. There is no definition of disinformation. But the one that we're going to use and think that is a fair one is content that encompasses false, inaccurate or misleading information that is designed, so there's an intention element there, and is presented and promoted to intentionally cause harm or generate profit. So we've kind of nuanced and we've mashed together a whole bunch of different guidelines from UNESCO, from different special rapporteurs, from different general comments, to say what are the main harms of disinformation? Right. One, it's done intentionally. Misinformation, when your mom sends something to you on WhatsApp, that's a bit random. You're like, lol, mom, what are you doing? She's not intentionally trying to cause harm. She's just being a mom. Whereas disinformation, you're sending something because you want a reaction. You want something to go wrong, or you want to make some money. So you're misleading people in order to generate profit.
So good old-fashioned propaganda.
Nailed it.
Gotcha. Cool.
So maybe I can take you through how we've structured this briefing note. We've started off with why an ombud, what this ombud will be, and how we get to the ombud. So it's a 3-part piece. Firstly, why an ombud? In William's mind, why not? But we need to give a little bit more substance to that, otherwise people won't buy in. So firstly, ombuds are a widely accepted form of effective and accessible dispute resolutions. We've all heard of the term. We may call them ombudsmen. We're trying to be a bit more progressive and just call them ombuds so that it's not a purely gendered thing. They take various shapes and sizes, and they operate all around the world and have been doing so for hundreds of years. They started off in Sweden, and they're a pretty useful place for members of the public to go and figure out disputes against often quite powerful actors. So we know as a mechanism there's viability. We also know that none of our current mechanisms are quite right. And if we use, I'm going to use a lot of analogies because William has taught me that people generally buy in when you use crafty analogies. So if we take a Goldilocks and 3 Bears situation, nothing is quite right. Things are either too big, too broad, or they're not dealing with things specifically. We've looked at the Human Rights Commission, we've looked at ICASA, we've looked at the Press Council, we've looked at the FPB, we've looked at the Information Regulator, we've looked at all of the existing things in South Africa, and they all do really important things, and they should all continue to do so. But none of them are quite the right body to address disinformation in the way that we're hoping them, or that we're hoping this ombud will. So nothing fits, and that's the second reason why we have made this proposal. Thirdly, South Africa has a fantastically enabling environment for Ombud's officers. When doing this research, I was overwhelmed by how many we have, and I captured maybe a third of them, but we have it for cars, we have it for banks, we have it for insurance, we have it for health, we have it for consumers. Any type of engagement where people are using or making use of a service, there is some sort of structure to enable a dispute resolution mechanism. So South Africa enables this. We have a lot of enabling legislation that says, let's set up this body so that we can help people in this way. And the fourth and final reason why we think an ombud is a good idea is because the rest of the world is starting to think it's a good idea too. And again, no one has quite figured it out just right, but there are interesting ways in which the Australians are dealing with it. They currently have just proposed to their parliament a slightly different ombud to what we're suggesting, but an ombud structure as well. We know through the Digital Services Act there's different structures. Ofcom has a structure. There's been different proposals by the London School of Economics. There are all these different ideas going around globally because everybody recognizes that disinformation in particular is a problem, and we need a way to fix it that isn't harsh regulation that stifles freedom of expression. So there's this recognition that we need a more nuanced approach, and we are taking these lessons and we're drawing on different tidbits of the international community's ideas and experiences to come up with this. So those are the 4 reasons as to why we think an ombud is a good idea.
And I must say, I'll be very honest, when I first read the brief document, I thought, wow, this is a great idea, but I was a little bit nervous. And I was nervous because I was thinking about issues like jurisdiction. How is this really going to work? I mean, the internet is an ocean. And being a reviewer on Rail 411, I have first-hand experience on how difficult disinformation can really make lives. Or our lives, particularly during the elections that we've just had, where people, spread disinformation deliberately, casting aspersions on the IEC and its ability to run free and fair elections. I'm sure everybody's probably heard the phrase, "Oh, the elections are rigged," and then that just becomes the rhetoric. And social media is the daily diet of many people and how they consume information, but that information is unverified. So it leaves a huge and wide gap for, how can I call them, bad actors to just come in and spew disinformation. So then I read the brief and I thought, wow, this is a perfect solution. But wait, hold on. I mean, we've all read, or I've read most freedom of expression judgments, and our courts really promote freedom of expression as a right, which is not an absolute right, because I read this to mean that we will be regulating user content. But Tina's just beautifully clarified that it's more geared towards regulating the platform's conduct when it comes to online disinformation.
Exactly, and that's a really important distinction. So why this ombud is different to what Ofcom does or what the e-safety regulator in Australia does is it's very focused just on disinformation. We're not dealing with the plethora of other online harms. Hate speech, we have legislation, we have structures to do that. Incitement, we have routes, we have avenues. We currently don't have anything for disinformation. So this is narrowly focused on disinformation, and it's about the platform's role in enabling disinformation. What did they fail to do in removing it? Are their community standards sufficient? Are they moderating content well enough? Do they have reasonable reporting platforms? What role are they playing, and what is their conduct in this game? So when someone approaches the OIO for short, they are not doing it because they're upset about something that you said. They're upset because the platform failed to act appropriately to address the pattern or the singular instance of disinformation.
And so, Tina, maybe if I could ask you this then, would we then have to devise a test, or would that be for the Ombud to devise a test on what a reasonable platform would have done in a particular situation?
Yes. Exactly, and this could be done in a few ways. So the current thinking is we would, depending on views from the team, we could either go really big and have a Platform Accountability Act that addresses everything, or we go slightly small and start off with what we would call an Online Ombud Integrity Act, which is the enabling legislation that enables the Ombud, and that's a very structural and procedural act. How many people sit on it? What is its scope and its functions? What does it do? Many of our ombuds are set up in this way. Then substantively, how it would function would be through rules or through codes of conduct, like with the Press Council and other organizations like that, where it would set out to say, these are the ways in which we assess this type of conduct. it is hard, and they will be erring into the more uncomfortable spaces around freedom of expression, but they're not per se going to make a finding that this conduct is disinformation. The finding is this platform failed to act when reports were made. So the finding is about the platform's failures or negligence rather than what the individual user said or posted.
And I mean, I think let's just be honest, the platforms thrive on engagement. So if I'm sparring with Noor here, regardless of who's right and who's wrong, the mere fact that there's a lot of traffic that drives, ad revenue and all that jazz, do we have a sense at least of what the response would be from the big platforms on this?
So this was the biggest sticking point that we had. How are we going to get the platforms to buy in? Why would they? Why would they care about the tiny little OIO based in South Africa saying, hey, be better, don't enable disinformation? And fair question, they probably won't, if we're being quite honest. Why would they? But what we have tried to do, and I would really welcome views on this because I'm somewhat on the fence about it, but if we have a disincentive-incentive model, right? We've seen that platforms have been willing to engage with organizations like Real 411 during elections. So we know there's an appetite for them to be seen to be doing good. So we should enable that. We should encourage that and say, if you become a member of the OIO or you gain certification through the OIO, you get a little thumbs up from us and say you're doing the right thing because you want to be part of this process where you're trying to be better. So we want to incentivize them to engage. If over a period of 18 months or 2 years, they've had really good practices and there have been no complaints about them, we could issue them a certificate of good performance. We could potentially, and this may be slightly more controversial, but offer some sort of tax incentive if there are tax implications for their operations here, like we do with massive organizations in the context of environmental sort of ESG requirements, saying you've done something good, you get a bit of a tax break. We know these are profit-making organizations, we know money matters, so let's feed into that. Let's find different ways to make them want to buy in. So that's the incentive, that's kind of the hook. Right. And then the disincentives are, if you're naughty, there will be consequences because there needs to be a bit more accountability if what we're trying to achieve is platform accountability.
And just before I think we open up to the floor, because I think the purpose of this session is to get as much feedback as possible, I just want to say I'm really disappointed with the legislative making process and how it takes a long time to see an act come to pass. I was just reading a judgment, it was a privacy freedom of expression case, and in there, one of the applicants alleged that, digital vigilantism is a thing, and by virtue of his personal information being out there, he was being geared up to be targeted. And what the court said there was that, firstly, you're exaggerating. I thought that was a bit rude. But secondly, that we would want to, it exists, this digital vigilantism thing, but we want to defer to the existing legislative and law-making processes and institutions like Parliament. So I guess what I'm trying to say is invariably in some way or another, we're probably going to end up at the doorstep of the legislature because we do need legislative reforms. And I think propaganda is not a new thing. Stratcom existed and it did what it did. In fact, I was reading Paul Erasmus's interviews, like transcripts of an interview that he did, and how it was a deliberate thing to, delegitimize Winnie Mandela, Chris Hani, and all those other people. I guess the difference now is that online it can happen rapidly and quickly, and it can become so confusing that it's very difficult to tell what's truth, or what's fact, and what's fiction. But yeah, so I'm for this, but I would like us to really thresh out how we're going to do this. So we will be taking questions, comments from the audience, contributions, preliminary remarks.
And if you want more explanations, you're like, what are the nuts and bolts? How does this actually work? Ask, and I will maybe tell you, depending if I have an answer.
Even if you think it's rubbish, tell us.
Thank you. I wanted to ask something with regards to disinformation as well. Oh, sorry, William. Hi, everyone. My name is Ompa Chamano from the Center for Human Rights. So I wanted to get more insight into content moderation and disinformation. So there's the whole big meta case that's happening currently. but from the general public, or rather, yes, from the general public, there's concerns on how Meta and its policy regulation is not somewhat centered or curated for the global south. How's the online Integrity Ombud going to integrate the different narratives that are found within the global south?
Completely fair question. I suppose one of the useful sort of motivating factors for why we're starting small is that the Ombud will be South African based and it will be for South African users, so the context will be South African. The hope, I'm sure, as William's hope would be, is that we end up with an Ombud who sits within the African Commission, potentially, and we have a continental Ombud who manages things continentally, and we take into different contexts and different views there. But if Meta, for example, fails to act on excessive patterns of disinformation that are very unique to the South African context, the Ombud would be well placed to pick up on that and say, you should have done more. You should have exercised more due diligence and more care in being aware of what was going on in the country, because as a result of you failing to do this, this is what has happened. So because it's locally based and South African rooted, it could potentially be closer to the context question. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Tsegofatso from GCIS. I just wanted to know, in terms of defining online, does it mean the big Metas, Google, etc., or are we also talking small platforms like podcasters, etc.? I just want to know the definition.
So the initial intention was to go after social media platforms, but I do, and I think we will need to be quite careful as to how we define that when we get to an act, who is a member and who is not. But if we were to go after small to big, the incentive-disincentive model would also be scaled. So the fine we would impose on Meta would be different to the fine we would impose on the two-person podcast, for example. So we would read that in, but online social media platforms is what we've been focusing on at this stage.
My name is Isaac Menar.
This is the question I'm the most scared for.
Well, let's see how this goes. So if I'm a member of the public and I see a piece of disinformation and I complain to the Ombud, what happens next?
Fair enough.
Sorry, Tina. My understanding, Tina, you'll correct me, is that as a member of the public, you first approach the platform, because a lot of them have channels.
After I've done that, and then I take it to the Ombud, what happens next?
Fair enough. So I've started mapping this out, but I don't have the exact answer. But in my mind, it will be kind of like the organogram approach that the short-term insurance Ombud uses. So you'll arrive physically at the office or virtually on the office and fill out a form. There'll be an initial assessment. Have you exhausted all internal remedies, i.e. the processes with the platform? What is the nature of it? And then you provide a brief description. If the initial reviewer assessing that sees straight off the bat that this is clearly hate speech, the Ombud will not take it further. It will be referred to the Human Rights Commission. Or if it is clearly incitement, it may be referred to SAPS, depending on the nature. But if it is likely to be disinformation, again, the Ombud's not making a decision at this stage, it will then trigger the investigation procedure. And there'll be short turnaround times. We haven't settled on them yet, but this will then go to the Ombud, who will assess the complaint and issue a request to the platform, like they do with the banks or the insurers when there's been an insurance issue. This complaint has been laid against you. This is the substance of the complaint. You have 5 days to respond. What have you done to address this? They say, this doesn't violate our community standards, or we don't care, or they just don't respond, potentially. So subject to how they respond, you'll then get a normal back and forth process to enable sort of audiatum paltrum, to let people exchange and respond to allegations leveled against them. And then the Ombud will make a finding. If the Ombud finds that there is disinformation, then they'll make a recommendation. The recommendation could be a fine. It could say, we recommend that you remove this, depending on the nature of it. And then we will need to envisage an appeal process. And we've so far received 2 different feedback feedback points on this, which are quite interesting. One is that that's the final decision. Because you've already tried at the platform, you've now tried at the Ombud, your next option is to review the decision in a court, or there's an internal appeal mechanism within the Ombud, which is quite normal for current Ombud structures in South Africa. So you would still have an appeal process there, after which, if you wanted to, you could go to a court. What that would then look like does become more complicated because of the jurisdiction question and how our courts are struggling to found jurisdiction against platforms, whereas the Ombud, based on a membership model, might have a bit more sway. But that was quite a long answer, and I'm not sure if it was exactly what you wanted.
So you're saying that disinformation that is not, doesn't cover any criminal offenses, that's what's dealt with?
Yes.
So I want to give another example and then come back, right? So in discussions around the continent on media regulation, there are essentially three models. There's statutory regulation, there's statutory independent regulation. And what that means is there's a law for media regulation, but it, in some other way, guarantees independent mechanism to deal with it, meaning, for instance, that there's not somebody from government sitting on an adjudication panel and so on. And then you have the system we have in South Africa, where there's no law. And we've always said in South Africa, we have freedom of expression, freedom of the media, access to information in the Bill of Rights. And there's no law telling us how to do it. And we love that. What you're proposing, as if I understand it, is a system of statutory independent disinformation legislation. Now, when we speak to other African countries and we try to convince them not to go for that, we say to them, the same parliament who passed that bill can next year decide, no, 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 we're now going to make it full statutory, no independent. So why do we want to ask for legislation if we can do this without legislation? Thank you.
Good question. I think it's debatable. I think if we don't legislate, and we're not legislating disinformation. By legislate, I mean we legislate the establishment of a body. If we don't, it may not have as much teeth if it's not founded in law. It also may not have as much accountability if it doesn't have that legal basis behind it, where it has to be consistent with our constitution. And my sense is platforms, there may be more of a respect for it if it is founded in law, rather than all of us sitting together saying, we've started an Ombud, listen to us, who are we? But if we are concerned that governments are going to react poorly later down the line, we need to put safeguards up in place, but we also can't make all of our decisions now based on a fact that may happen. Currently, we have a good constitution, and that gives us a lot of power and a lot of scope to make sure that things are done properly. For us to not want to legislate now because we are concerned for something later down the line means that in the interim, we may not have a feasible mechanism then to address disinformation. So it is somewhat of a catch-22, and I hear you. And my gut is we need a legislative basis to give it body and teeth. But fight me, I'm ready.
I'm not fighting, I just want to ask. So if you look at the mandate of the Human Rights Commission, and I know that there's some analysis done on this, but I was wondering in any case, if without extending the mandate of the Human Rights Commission, whether it would not be possible to come up with a mechanism within the current legislation that should first try to see that if the Human Rights Commission come up with something like this, reporting to them, which gives you some guarantees, and the message is, we're setting this thing up. We're not asking for a new law at this stage. We're setting this up under the auspices of the Human Rights Commission, and only if the platforms will not cooperate, then we will ask for legislation. I was just wondering if that's not a better strategic way to segue into exactly what you propose.
It's the exact conversation we were having shortly before this, and I think William would agree. His approach was slightly more aggressive, and he suggested we should threaten them with legislation to force them to engage. I like your wording slightly more, Isak. I've got no issue with that. I'm very persuadable on this being housed in the Human Rights Commission. It means that we're accepting that disinformation has rights implications. The Human Rights Commission currently is mandated to deal with human rights violations, so there's an acceptance that disinformation does erode particularly information rights. And I think it might be a swifter approach. It is one of those, we've suggested 4 avenues to setting it up, and it is one of the options that we've considered. And we do know that the Human Rights Commission is interested. They've published their social media charter. We've seen Eileen is now heading up the, I can't recall the name, but there's clearly an interest from the Commission. So we have no issue with that, and we would actually really welcome hearing it from them. I understand that William will be sharing this with them. I think it could be a swifter approach and a subtle threat, but in a more measured way.
So if I may just chime in, Isak, I think the briefing document also makes that proposal, because we're at the stage where we're just trying to see what might work, what might not work. But to a certain extent, I do agree with Tina around the call for legislation. Maybe it's the Kool-Aid we drink in law school, but I think legislation still remains quite a potent and powerful and possibly effective way to drive change. And in this fast-paced online disinformation world, we're really desperate for change because, I don't know, I kept saying to William and Tina just before the session that I feel like we're on the cusp of a new world order. I'm not sure what it looks like or it might look like. Maybe I'll wait for the US elections, then I can tell you what I think. But it's scary.
Coming from the same person who said that legislation takes so long.
It does. It really does.
Well, not if it's just legislation to enable an ombud. If we are coming up with what we've started referring to as the Platform Accountability Act, that's going to take us a couple years, if not a decade, like it took us to do cybercrimes in Papua. But if we're just having a 5-page act that establishes an ombud, I think that could take 2.5 years, realistically. But if we go to the Commission, it may take 18 months. But it also took them 18 months to do the Digital Rights Charter, the Social Media Charter. So I think time is something we need to bear in mind. I know William's ready to go tomorrow, but legislation could take time, but I think if we go with the narrow legislation, it could be quicker.
Cool. Any comments from this side? We've only heard from the right side. Left side, nothing. Everybody's happy. Are you for it? There you go. Got a hand.
So as I understand it, you're targeting the platforms. How would you deal with individual influencers? Would that be within the mandate or? Oh, sorry, Juliana Thornton, and I'm a consultant. I work with Media Monitoring Africa and Henry Nkumalo Foundation.
It is something that we debated and have, for the sake of simplicity and wanting to keep the scope as narrow as possible, focus on the platforms rather than specific people. But it would be an interesting scenario if a person complained and said, this influencer is doing it, what did the platforms do? It would still be about the platforms. What did the platform do to rein in that influencer? Or to respond, or to flag content, or to remove content. It would still be about the platform.
And the influencer could just go to another platform.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Entirely. We're not going to fix everyone being bad. It is something that we debated. But if we want to go after individual conduct then I do think we get into the sticky mess of freedom of expression and that type of content moderation, which we're a bit uncomfortable with, and why there's been the pushback on regulating disinformation. Whereas if we go to the platforms and say, you didn't do enough, and then if a new platform does get started and we get them on board, we then enable that accountability then as well. But it would, William, I don't know if you see it differently, but that's my sense. William's nodding, for those who can't see him.
Thanks. I'm Graham. I'm from Evertainment.com, my own consultancy. Thank you. That was a really great presentation and facilitation. So one area that I'm not really clear on is how do you get the platforms themselves to participate in it, and what kind of recourse would you see if they simply said, no, we're not prepared to participate in it, we don't recognize the jurisdiction of this particular ombuds body?
Graham, it's a fair question, and this is the second biggest issue we've grappled with. The first is jurisdiction. Why would the South African Ombud have any jurisdiction over platforms that don't have a base here? But we'll get to that shortly. Membership is tough. So what the Australians are proposing through their Ombud is to have a pilot that is compulsory. You have to sign up, otherwise you can't operate here. So they've gone quite aggressive. And I'm curious to see how that will pan out. But their pilot is to say it's mandatory membership initially, and then we'll assess whether or not it's voluntary. And our Ombud structures currently in South Africa are either mandatory, automatic, if you, kind of like with ICASA, if you get a license, you're then part of that space, or voluntary, where you sign up to accept it. Ideally, in a world where you don't want to force anyone to do anything, the voluntary approach would be preferable, but getting platforms to volunteer may be a struggle. But that's why we've used the Real 411 and the elections example, because that was quite a novel time where platforms were willing to engage with a civil society-led initiative during elections to say, yeah, we will listen to you. You can't really hold us accountable too much, you're not necessarily going to fine us, but we do want to engage. So we know that there's tentative interest, but we haven't fallen on a position, and we will need to, because this is an important part. But I would err on the voluntary approach first, but maybe that's too soft. William would probably want to go mandatory first, like the Australians. But the Australians are very close. As I understand it, it's going to be a few months, and they set it up. So we could also watch them for a bit and see whether or not it's successful, and whether this time next year they have any social media platforms operating in Australia or not.
And I must say, some platforms are better than others. Let's just be honest, the most problematic is X. Let's call a spade a spade. I don't speak for Meta, but I've observed, particularly during the elections that we've had in this country this year, they were really, really on board. At some point, I got a video. It was a rape that was taking place, and somebody had put that video on Instagram. Not sure about the location. I just reported that through the Trusted Partner platform program, and that video was down within minutes. I found Meta to be really responsive, and they've got an oversight board that supposedly works with Meta, not for Meta, so we're not sure about the independence there, but they're trying at the very least. Not sure about X, and well, actually I know about X, they're not trying, but I'm not sure about TikTok, which is also quite prominent. Isak.
I just want to respond to your singing the praises of Meta. Yes, they were good with what you're talking about. But what they also did was to reduce exposure to credible news for all their users. In fact, in community media, they actively stopped election news of reaching people's timelines. And that's bad.
Yeah, and that's a counter to disinformation, right? And that would be something that you would say, if the platform is not acting in addition to stopping spreading disinformation, but also harming the spread of credible information, that's a problem as well. And the Ombud should be able to then say, hey.
how would you enforce takedown if, let's take Meta, you report the matter, they don't take it down, you take it to the oversight board, they don't take it down, and then I come to you as last recourse, right? That's my understanding of how the chain would flow. And how would you then enforce takedown?
Enforcement, it's a really good question. And I think it could go down in a few different ways. One could be take it down or we fine you, quite aggressively. 2 could be flag this. 3 could be the Ombud releasing a statement saying, we've investigated this, we've found that platform Y has failed in its duties, and notify the public of it. So I think it doesn't always have to result in content moderation takedowns. I think the recommendations could be quite wide-ranging, if that answers your question.
Good day, my name is Mavatu from Communications. I'd like to find out, how do we ensure that we have responsible citizens? Because now when you look at social media, you can see that where it leads, it bleeds. South Africans or people at large are very entertained by news that is spreading so fast, and when you are responsible or sharing information that is empowering, they find you boring. But where there's more harm, it's more shared. So how do we ensure that citizens are responsible to, to minimize harm?
Fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked it. There's 3 powers that we see of the Ombud. The first is the complaints mechanism, which we've discussed quite a bit. The second is the accountability function, which links to the complaints mechanism, as well as requiring transparency reporting from the platforms to say this is what we've done over the last period to be better. And then the third is digital literacy and empowerment initiatives. So the Ombud also needs to play a role there, either through issuing sort of statements and engaging the public and engaging with organizations like Media Monitoring Africa and Web Rangers to say this is how and why we need to be better. But one of the interesting components that we're thinking about in terms of the fines and the financial consequences of the harm is that when the money gets paid, it will be paid into a fund that will be used to enable digital literacy programs. We know it's all well and good to say, like, let's all do digital literacy, it's important. You actually need to fund it quite realistically. And so we want to kind of do a little bit of a Robin Hood-esque approach where we take the money from the big platform and we use it to do good. So we definitely see that as one of the 3 pillars of the Ombud, is to ensure that it is participating in ensuring that it is supporting digital literacy initiatives as well, and potentially getting platforms to do so as part of its transparency reporting.
Great question, Mawat. You know what they say these days? Nobody cares about the truth when the lie is more entertaining. So I'm going to go to Uyanda, who's got a question.
Thank you, Khothaza. My hand has been up for the longest time. I was about to stand up and scream for attention.
Sorry.
It's okay. My question, I just want to pick up on what you said, Tina, earlier about how difficult it is, how difficult it is to define disinformation, right? And I know we have a working definition that helps everybody understand what disinformation is, but with that in mind and the fact that a lot of platforms have got different community guidelines, so how will the ombudsman, synchronize that, especially in terms of judgments, to make sure that the judgment is fair and just across all different platforms? Because I think the judgments themselves can then help in consecuting what disinformation actually is.
Such a good question. My tentative response, and I may need to reflect on it a little bit more, is the definition or the code of practice or the rules that guides the OIO would have a definition that's reasonably broad, but also relatively objective, so that if it's applied to different platforms that may have slightly different definitions or understandings, I'm going to be very boring and use a legal test, but a reasonable person in that situation. So would a reasonable platform in this situation have allowed this to go on the way that it did? So we may need to craft that type of objective test as part of it so that it's not the Ombud doesn't become bound or forced to be inconsistent with its rulings based on different community standards. But it's a really good question.
And I think it's good that we're only focusing on disinformation because we're really cleaning up the river, to use your analogy. Oh, is it William's analogy? I think anything more than that, we would be really in a tricky spot, particularly because the Constitution guarantees the right to free flows of information, expression. So we want to leave that intact because that's a good thing. But we want to deal with these mushrooms, or I don't know how else to describe them. But we want to do some tidying up so that we've got a healthy information ecosystem. Cool. Are there any more points to be made? Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Leah. I'm a German diplomat working for the German embassy in Pretoria, and we're most interested in disinformation by state actors, mostly Russia. We've seen this increase quite a lot in Germany, but also here on the African continent. And I was wondering, how are you planning to tackle this? Would that be through the platforms as well as we've heard for individuals? Or can you think of any other approaches? Thank you.
It's something that we spoke about. Tatso asked, he said, why would government want to sign on to this? Why would they want to enable this when they are often the biggest purveyors of disinformation themselves? Fair. The hope is we have reasonable people in government, but I appreciate that might be youthful optimism coming from me. I think it would again be a twofold response, speaking just to the South African context. So if prominent actors are purveying disinformation through their platforms or through their own personal platforms, and the platforms themselves are not doing enough, the Ombud engages with the platforms. But if it's in the context of elections, we have our bodies like the IEC, and we have our codes of conduct there that would regulate it. And potentially as well through the sort of the communications or the notes that the Ombud puts out, they could say that politician X or platform Y has failed to remove several posts of politician X. We found that they failed to act in accordance with sort of appropriate standards. And that is just a different trigger or a different way of phrasing it rather than forcing any sort of conduct or going directly against the politician. But it's likely to be an increasing problem where the most powerful actors in our societies are the ones who are saying the most untruthful things.
I mean, but the sense I get is you're talking also about foreign influences and networks and how they operate, as opposed to just our own politicians and the dangerous things they say. So, in the way we're thinking about this is, at the moment, we use Real 411 and we can send things through in an election period to the IEC. The plan is that you would then be able to use that information to then go and conduct, open source investigations into those things. And if you find that there's evidence of networks, so if, for example, if there's entities that are doing that work in South Africa, and then they were to submit that report to the Ombud could then say to the platforms, this is a big problem, you need to investigate this and come back to us and tell us if you're finding the same kinds of network operating there. That happens now, right? It's just that it's not in any clear and transparent manner. So you've got organizations like Digital Forensic Research Lab that does exactly these kinds of investigations, and they submit them to the platforms directly. Until and unless they reveal that information to the public through news articles, for example, we have no idea about that as the members of the public. Having this Ombud would then start to make sure that you build in transparency and accountability for those kinds of processes as well. Because you can easily imagine a scenario. At the moment, you've got DFR. They do very good research, and they say, here's a bad actor network. But you could equally imagine the Pupo Elon Musk network group who decides to say that they don't like these people that talk about women having rights, and they are a whole lot of feminists on X, and they should be taken off because they're promoting equal rights, and that's wrong, and it's disinformation. And then they would submit that to the platform. And obviously in that instance, well, hopefully, I mean, if it's Elon Musk, he'll probably go, yeah, great, and remove them. So again, that's why you need to introduce transparency and accountability to that, so that they would submit that report then to the Ombud, and the Ombud would look at it and go, well, you're a bunch of nutters, and this isn't in line with a human rights-based approach, and you need lots of hugs and probably to go and spend a lot of time thinking about unicorns and then piss off and then not do anything.
Maybe I can quickly just jump in on the jurisdiction point. I'm sorry that I misunderstood it, but one of the ways in which we're hoping to found jurisdiction is similar to a bit of a combination of the Digital Services Act and the British Online Safety Act, which we appreciate has some challenges, but jurisdictionally it's quite useful. And what we want to do is say that the Ombud can engage with platforms that have a link to the Republic of South Africa. And this isn't in the sort of civil way where they have a physical presence or they are the ones conducting harm, but it's that they have a significant number of users in South Africa. So we'll need to figure out what significant means, but a reasonable number of users. That the users are one of the platform markets, and that the content on the platform poses a risk to users in South Africa. And so to use examples of sort of Russian politicians spewing disinformation, if that's resulting in harms to people in South Africa, then it could be something that could be addressed through the Ombud. So it's about establishing if people in South Africa, not per se South African citizens by any means, people in South Africa, if there is a harm to them, then the Ombud can be engaged. Or influencers, or yeah.
So Tina, I think the overwhelming sentiment is that this is something worth exploring further.
Well, I don't know. I feel like we should have a vote.
Oh, should we? Okay.
Democracy.
Are we doing claps or... Oh, let's do the clap. We did claps last night. So clap if you think this is worth pursuing. Clap if you think this is a waste of time. Let's just keep it moving. Well, okay, I think that's encouraging because like I said, I was just sitting on the fence, not sure which way, the pendulum will swing. But for me, the key takeaways is the jurisdiction issue. Tegofat's alluded to the takedown stuff and how you enforce those. I have to explore Isak's contention on whether legislation is the right purpose vehicle or should we just explore existing remedies. Particularly when we go to other African countries and tell them, don't regulate. But where does that leave us then? What would our next steps be, Tina?
Well, I thank you everyone for listening and engaging. And if you are genuinely interested and want to read the document and have thoughts and comments, they would be most welcome. So William will send those on to those who have an interest. I've got a few reflections from today that I want to mull over a little bit and will probably feed into the draft if William lets me. And I think a few practical steps. I think we should sit down with the Human Rights Commission and test this with them to see if it's feasible and what that would look like and what their timeframes would be and what internal processes they may need to consider. That could be quite a quick win, and so I'm quite persuadable on that. I think we should have parallel conversations with different members of government to see what their appetite is as well, just to test that, to see if we could legislate.
Right.
I still think there's some value there. So I think we need to continue on slightly more focused stakeholder engagements with those who we actually want to house the body and see if they are keen or not.
George has a question.
George from MMA. I might have missed it. Who funds ombuds?
Yeah, didn't tell you, so you didn't miss it.
Sorry.
But I have an answer. So it would be similar to how many of our ombuds in South Africa currently run. Often when you sign up, you pay sort of a membership fee or a license fee. This would also be on a sliding scale based on the sort of profit margin of the platform. So the biggest platforms would pay the biggest contributions, and the smallest ones would pay, it would be a sort of a percentage-based sliding scale. And then the fines that would be imposed, part would go into the Digital Literacy or Media Public Interest Fund, and then some would enable the sustainability of the Ombud. I think the Ombud will need to do some fundraising, as all Ombuds need to do. Questions around who funds Ombuds and what that means for independence are questions that we should ask and be aware of. But I don't think it should be a purely government-funded body, because then there may become independence questions there as well. So the idea is for it to be a member-based payment to fund the functioning of it.
Sweet Jones. I suppose we could call it, unless...
Can I say one more?
Tina, you've got lots more to say.
No,
So
it
tell
has
us.
nothing to do with this per se, but to do with William. I said at the beginning of this that I'm somewhat persuaded. I'm somewhat more persuaded after saying it out loud, so thank you for giving the opportunity. And I would welcome if we could do the clap activity again to give a clap to William, who genuinely has been pushing this not for any other reason than he genuinely cares about trying to make the world a better place and fix disinformation, which is a complicated issue that we don't want to get wrong. So he's been patient and kind in giving me far more time than I should have had to get to this stage now. But a genuine shout out and thank you to William for doing this, because you care and you want the world to be better. Thank you.
Go, William! Woo! Thank you, William. Thank you, Tina. Well, thank you, everybody. We were scheduled, for an hour and a half, but I think we've really covered everything, and we've gotten the feedback that I certainly needed the feedback that we've just received, because now I'm buying into the idea even more, and I'm happy to run with it alongside you, Tina and William. I hope no one's recording this. But thanks very much indeed. Thanks, everybody, for the participation. Looking forward to see where we land with this. And yeah, William, will you direct everybody as to what happens after now?
Yes, thank you. Okay, and thank you to our fabulous discussant and Tina for leading it. Apparently he's a discussant. Right, so we usually have small, here they come. There you go. These are your things. If you read Independent online, you would believe that this is a bag of money that we're giving to Tina that is sponsored by the CIA. Sadly, it isn't, because if it was that amount of money, we would be stealing it and we would be having a bigger party, actually. So, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Khotatso. There's one last session to our Media Freedom Festival, which starts at 6 o'clock. So please hang around. It's a lovely afternoon. There's places you can sit and work. And that's going to be a really cool way to end off our Media Freedom Festival. It's looking at media sustainability and viability. I can't for the life of me remember who's on the panel, because I haven't looked at it recently. But it will be a cracker of a session, because all of them have been. Those of you who are here this morning for this morning's session saw how cool that was. And then this is our last intimate conversation, and then tomorrow we all go back to normal life. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.